Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. In this video, I want to talk to you guys about live end, dead end. Go back to the roots, look at the actual original paper by Don Davis and Chips Davis, who came up with live and dead end, and to see if this still makes sense, how this still makes sense, what it actually means, how it's supposed to work, and most importantly, if we can actually use it in our home studios. And the reason is that I've been meaning to talk about these more general, holistic approaches to control room designs. I find them really interesting, right? It all started, as far as I know, with live end, dead end back in the 80s, but then we've had reflection-free zone, we've had non-environment rooms. There's obviously the most modern approach, in my opinion, the front-to-back control room design by Northwood Acoustics. And they all have their own take on building out, treating professional studios' control rooms with their own approaches, with their own theories behind them. And it's really interesting to see why they came up with these ideas, how they came up with them, and what they're trying to achieve. But that also means going back to the original research, and it can be a bit, I don't know, complicated, theoretical, maybe even just a bit boring to just read through research papers with you. So I'm going to do the alternative and actually let my good friends Bob and Jane, that's what I'm going to call them, of Notebook LM fame, talk us through the research paper instead and just respond to what they have to say. But before I do that, if you want a proper practical approach to treating your home studio that actually works, that has proven to work, then I want you to download my home studio treatment framework at the link in the description. These are my 5 steps to systematically treating a home studio and getting it to translate. It's very much a top-level, step-by-step perspective process for you to follow in order for you to not have to turn in circles, to make sure that you're actually doing the right thing at the right time, starting off with what is most important when you're basically starting with an empty room and then taking you through that process step by step to the finished treated room. So it's all in there, like finding your listening position, setting up your speakers, working with broadband absorption, working with resonance absorption, how to think about measurements as part of treating a home studio, when to bring in a subwoofer, speaker decoupling. It's all in there, nicely there, laid out for you to follow, so you understand what it is you need to focus on and what you can actually ignore as part of all of these steps. So if you're treating a home studio, if you're in the process, if you are facing a particular issue and you don't know what the next step is to tackle that, then make sure you download and check out my home studio treatment framework at the link in the description. But with that, let's dive into live and dead end. And here's the original paper by Don and Chips Davis from the 1980s, the LEDE concept for the control of acoustic and psychoacoustic parameters in recording control rooms. And here's what that looks like. There's a lot of maths in there. There's a lot of nice diagrams in there. There's some pictures of measurements in there. And I'm going to have this open on the side while we look at, or while we listen to, rather, Bob and Jane from Notebook LM. If you don't know what Notebook LM is, it's basically an artificial intelligence platform by Google, and you can upload any number of sources into a particular project, and it will then create this notebook amongst which it actually creates a podcast that we can listen to. And it's really fun. It's really interesting. It's quite surprising how well this works. So let's just jump in and see what Bob and Jane can tell us about live and dead end.
All right. So for all of you out there, spending hours in your studios trying to get your mix just right.
Yeah.
And you tweak things and adjust things and something's still off.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever thought that maybe it's the room itself that's messing with you?
Yeah.
That's where this concept of LEDE comes in.
Uh-huh.
Isn't that incredible? I mean, I told it to talk to home studio audio professionals, but still.
It stands for live end dead end.
Okay.
It's a way of designing a control room
Right.
so that you can hear your mix more accurately without the room getting in the way.
Yeah.
It's a really common misconception that you need a massive, expensive studio to achieve a good sound.
Right.
But the LEDE concept, it kind of emerged in the late 70s, and it really addresses this fundamental problem that plagues even the most basic setups. These pesky early reflections.
Early reflections.
Yeah.
I feel like for someone who's spent countless hours battling those, I still find them kind of mysterious.
Right.
Have you been battling early reflections for countless hours? Interesting.
You break it down for us?
Yeah.
What is the big deal about them?
Imagine that you are listening to a track.
Okay.
And the sound waves from your speakers are traveling straight to your ears.
Right.
That's the direct sound, the purest form of what you are trying to mix.
Yeah.
But those same sound waves are also bouncing off all the surfaces in your room.
Oh, right. Of course.
Your walls, your ceiling, your desk, everything.
Okay.
These reflections, they arrive at your ears shortly after the direct sound, and that creates interference and it muddies the waters.
So it's kind of like trying to listen to a podcast.
Right.
Well, someone's whispering in your ear at the same time.
Yeah.
All these extra sounds are just confusing things.
Yeah, and this confusion is especially problematic in those critical early milliseconds after the direct sound.
Right.
Our brains are kind of wired to process those initial milliseconds with extra care because they contain a lot of information about the sound's location and timbre.
So early reflections are kind of hijacking our brain's ability to hear the true sound. That's pretty sneaky.
That's right.
So how does LED actually accomplish this sonic magic?
So just for me to summarize, in case you aren't aware of this, so yeah, early reflections, what they're talking about is, again, reflections that happen within kind of the first 20 to 40, 50 milliseconds after the direct sound from your speakers arrives at your ear, right? And because our brain isn't capable of separating those from the direct sound within that time window, those first up to 50 milliseconds, it actually integrates that into what we're hearing. So from a psychoacoustic perspective, where we can't tell exactly where a source is located, the direct sound is coming from, because that reflection actually masks or muddies the perception of the localization, really. Yeah, so that's kind of what's happening in our brains. On top of that, on a signal perspective, so a purely technical perspective, when the direct sound interferes, or rather when the reflection interferes with the direct sound, it creates a comb filter. It actually messes up like Jane said, the timbre, the tonality of the sound. And I think there's some graphs in here that these ones here, I'm not entirely sure what these are showing us from how it's described. It says this is actually basically an energy time curve. So we've got volume, if you will, on the vertical scale, and then time on the horizontal scale. But this looks to me like a frequency response. So this isn't volume over time, but volume over frequency. So it's a bit confusing. But basically, this is what the comb filter looks like, right? So that's what Don and Chips Davis identified and tried to combat with this control room design concept. Let's keep listening.
Well, it all starts with kind of dividing the control room into two distinct acoustic zones, the live end and the dead end.
So it's like creating this sonic landscape where each zone has a specific purpose.
Exactly.
I'm intrigued. Now, paint me a sonic picture of these two zones.
All right, so behind the listener is the live end.
Okay.
It's designed to be reflective and diffuse, scattering the sound in many directions. It kind of simulates the spaciousness of a much larger room.
Okay.
And then in front of the listener is the dead end.
Yeah.
That area is highly absorptive.
Okay.
We want to kind of minimize early reflections coming from the speakers, the console, basically anything in front of you.
So live end is all about creating a sense of spaciousness.
Right.
While the dead end keeps things tight and controlled.
Exactly. And by strategically controlling the timing and level of reflections, LEDE takes advantage of a really fascinating psychoacoustic phenomenon known as the Haas effect.
The Haas effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds intriguing.
So think about those delayed reflections bouncing off the live end of the room.
Okay.
According to the Haas effect, even if those reflections are quite loud, our brains effectively mask them if they arrive within a certain time window after the direct sound.
So they kind of blend in and just add to the overall spaciousness.
Yeah.
Rather than sounding like distinct echoes.
Exactly.
So you're telling me a hard reflective rear wall, while seemingly counterintuitive,
Right.
actually contributes to a more natural spacious sound without creating those annoying echoes.
That's right.
Yeah. So it's funny how Bob and Jane AI summarize that, because obviously a purely hard reflective surface doesn't cause any diffusion, right? It doesn't cause any scattering of the sound. What we can see here in the image, actually, if we look at this top-down diagram, is that they have these angled sections of wall basically on the back that are supposed to scatter the sound, right? So it's not proper diffusion in this particular approach. It's more of a broad scattering by redirecting the energy, the reflections away from the listening position, right? And if we look at that in a measurement, in a time perspective, from a time perspective, then this is what that looks like, right? So we've got our initial direct sound here. This is the impulse response, basically, or the energy time curve, right? If you will. There's volume on the vertical, and then we have time on the horizontal axis. So our speakers play a sound, and within a certain time period, it arrives at the microphone, which is this particular impulse right here. Yeah. So after that, as time passes, the sound that gets reflected from the room also arrives back at the microphone, right? And because they have to travel further, they take more time. Hence, they are further to the right in this diagram here, right? And so it actually marks these first initial early reflections. It says here first significant reflections, second and third, and so on, right? And then we've got a whole bunch of other more less or not so loud reflections happening, and they constitute basically the reflection pattern of the room. And what live and dead end tries to do is create this initial time delay gap where, because we're controlling the early reflections that happen right after the direct sound, we're trying to reduce those. There's actually a gap that gets created until the first significant reflection arrives back at the microphone or the ear. And this gap needs to be basically larger than well, they're going to tell us in a second, but it basically needs to be big enough so that we're not confusing the sound field, the reflection pattern of the room. Our ears can separate that from the actual reflection pattern that is part of the recording that we're listening to. Yeah. So just to give you a brief idea already what that means. All right. Let's keep listening.
All about timing and diffusion.
So this brings us to our main source for this deep dive.
Yeah.
This 1980 paper by Don and Chips Davis.
Right.
The pioneers of the LEDE concept.
Mm-hmm.
I bet their paper is a gold mine of information.
It is.
All right, we've kind of laid the groundwork here.
Yeah.
We've explored this problem of early reflections.
No.
And LDE offers a pretty
No. They're great, these two.
ingenious solution.
All right.
Now I'm ready to delve into the nitty-gritty details of the Davis paper.
Okay.
Uncover the secrets
Okay.
of creating a truly accurate listening environment.
Sounds good. Welcome back to our deep dive into LEE control rooms.
All right.
I don't believe we left at any point, but okay.
I'm ready to uncover more of the secrets hidden within the Davis paper.
Oh, yeah. And there are plenty of fascinating details to explore. Remember how we talked about that reflection-free zone in the dead end?
Right.
Well, the Davis paper dives into this rather sneaky culprit that can disrupt this pristine pathway.
Okay.
Early sound.
Okay.
Early Early sound, that sounds like something straight out of a science fiction movie.
It might sound strange,
Yeah.
but EEEs is a real phenomenon that can
yeah.
wreak havoc on your listening experience.
Interesting.
It's essentially sound that arrives at your ears before the direct sound from your speakers.
Wait, how is that even possible? Doesn't sound travel at a constant speed?
It does, but EES doesn't travel through the air directly.
Oh.
It takes a shortcut, often originating from speakers that aren't properly isolated from the structure of the room.
So the sound vibrations are sneaking through the walls or the floor
Right.
and arriving at my ears before the sound traveling through the air.
Exactly.
So just to summarize that once more, in case you kind of missed it or didn't understand as I was scrolling around in this paper trying to find where they actually describe this. So they're describing early reflections, EERs. And the idea here is that the sound from the speakers actually couples through the structure, for example, if they're placed directly on a desk. And the desk then, because sound can actually travel faster through hard matter than through the air, the sound will travel somewhere in the desk where it can emanate, where it can be reproduced once again by the desk. You won't really hear this consciously, but the problem is that that sound that actually comes from the vibration of the desk might actually arrive at your ear before the initial direct sound from the speakers. So in this graph here, it might actually arrive kind of somewhere around here, right before the actual direct sound. And that's what they're talking about here. That's what they're trying to, that's what they're describing, right? And that's kind of one of the main reasons why you do want to have some form of decoupling of your speakers, or rather, if you put them directly on the desk, for example, or in your typical producer desks, they have these shelves. If you just put the speakers on the shelf, the sound can actually couple into the desk and create these EERs, right? And you do want to avoid those. And in my experience, this is more anecdotal than anything. I haven't measured this in detail, looked at this kind of from a scientific perspective, try to research how this actually works. But if, for example, you put your speakers on your desk or that producer shelf and you get some really weird tonal changes, then that might be the cause. All right? Let's keep listening.
That's sneaky indeed.
And because sound travels faster through solids than through air,
Right.
this EES can arrive a few milliseconds before the direct sound, creating a subtle but noticeable smearing effect.
So it's like a sonic ghost arriving before its time and haunting my mix.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Thanks.
And even though ESS is usually quite low in level, our ears are incredibly sensitive to the timing of sound arrival.
Okay.
Anything that disrupts that expected order can throw off our perception.
This makes me wonder about my own studio setup.
Yeah.
What are some practical ways to combat this EES gremlin?
The key is speaker isolation.
Okay.
The Davis paper emphasizes the importance of decoupling your speakers from the room's structure. This could involve using isolation pads, stands, or even building a separate platform for your speakers.
So
Just to put this into a more practical approach for you, if you are thinking about this now, I made a video about this with Head Audio a while back, which I'll link in the card right now, where you can check out what my opinion is about speaker decoupling. There is a place for this. The problem in a nutshell is that properly decoupling a speaker is very hard because they're too light. You need a lot of mass, a lot of weight to actually create a decoupling system that decouples the entire audible spectrum. And that's, as far as I understand, not really possible with the weight of a single speaker. You need something way more heavy. And so that puts into question how these products actually work, in my opinion. And the other part of it is that it's really hard to measure. So I haven't seen any convincing measurement data that actually tells me, yes, decoupling works. Yeah, so this is a questionable subject at best. In my opinion, the easiest way to think about this, or the easiest way to approach this, is that if you can put your speakers on separate stands, if you have the space for them, and then that's it. You don't need to do any more. Just put them right on the stands. You don't need any extra fancy decoupling. But if you put your speakers on your desk, then invest in some sort of decoupling solution that also puts the speakers at the right height. And that's really more important here than the actual decoupling system, in my opinion. Yeah. So if you're going to put them on your desk, you got to make sure that your speakers are at the right height. And you might as well use one of the decoupling solutions out there to do that in order to also get, hopefully, the decoupling that this product promises. Yeah. If you want more details on that, I've got a whole free mini course on my website called the Phantom Speaker Test, and I go exactly through how to plan all of this, how to systematically figure out what the right approach is for your particular situation in that mini course, and you can sign up to that for free as well on acousticsinsider.com.
It's not just about treating the surfaces of the room.
Right.
It's also about how my speakers are physically connected to their surroundings.
Yeah, every detail matters.
Interesting. And speaking of details, the Davis paper also dives into the importance of achieving high density of early reflections in the live end of the room.
Right.
I've talked about diffusion,
Yeah.
but what exactly does density refer to in this context?
So imagine you're standing in a forest with trees scattered all around.
Okay.
The trees create this complex pattern of reflections as sound bounces off them.
Yeah.
Now, if the trees were perfectly spaced, you might hear distinct echoes.
But in a real forest, the reflections are all jumbled up,
Right.
creating a sense of spaciousness without any noticeable echoes.
Exactly.
Isn't that a great example? I think this is incredible that an AI can come up with something like that that is so visceral and so easy to understand, right? Imagine a forest and then putting up your speakers in the forest, your listening setup, yeah? And then you have an idea of what a diffuse sound field in a live and dead-end room might actually feel like. That's quite interesting, isn't it?
Exactly.
And that's what we are aiming for in the live end of the control room.
That's right.
A high density of reflections, carefully spaced in time, creates a smooth, diffuse sound feel that envelops the listener without any jarring echoes.
That's the goal.
So it's not just about having reflections, it's about having the right kind of reflections strategically arranged to create that natural immersive sound.
This is really interesting, right? If you're wondering if we're causing reflections, won't they cause, or if we're creating a dense reflection pattern, won't that also create these comb filters and these masking effects and this effect of diluting the localization? And the answer is no. Because that's only caused by these very distinct, where are they? These very distinct reflections. But if the reverberant field, the diffuse sound field is very densely packed and it kind of looks like this bottom bit here, it actually doesn't cause these comb filters, at least not at the quantity, at the amount where they are causing problems, right? So that's the idea behind diffusion, is you're trying to break up distinct specular reflections into a more spread out, more densely packed set of reflections at a lower level. Think about it that way, yeah?
That's right. And one of the key tools for achieving this is the diffuser.
Okay.
These specially designed surfaces scatter sound in a very controlled way, preventing those strong, isolated reflections that can color the sound.
I've seen those funky-looking panels in studios.
Yeah.
They're like sonic prisms, breaking up the sound and sending it off in different directions.
That's a great way to visualize it.
It's not, maybe, yeah. But what's funny is that in their plan view here, in the original paper, there are no proper diffusers on the back wall. It's just some angled surfaces, and that's it.
Thanks.
And the science behind diffuser design is fascinating. The Davis paper even mentions the work of Manfred Schroeder, who developed a mathematical formula for creating highly effective diffusers.
Wow, so there's serious math and physics behind these sonic tools.
There is.
And the goal is to create a live
Did we just have a third person come in? That's funny.
end that is not just lively,
Right.
but also smooth and controlled, providing that sense of spaciousness without any unwanted sonic artifacts. Yeah, exactly.
This is all incredibly insightful, but let's bring it back down to earth for a moment.
Okay.
Are there any practical tips from the paper that we can apply to our own listening spaces?
Yeah,
Even if we're not building a professional LED room from scratch?
absolutely. One of the key takeaways from the Davis paper is the importance of the initial time delay gap, or ITD.
Okay, I'm following so far, but why is this ITD so important?
Well, the Davis paper highlights this crucial relationship.
Okay.
The ITD of the control room should be longer than the ITD of the studio being monitored.
Interesting. So if I'm mixing a track that was recorded in a small, tight studio,
Uh-huh.
I'd want my control room to have an even longer ITD.
Right.
Why is that?
By making the control room's ITD longer, you're essentially tricking your brain into perceiving the studio's sound space first.
Ah, so I'm hearing the reflections of the virtual space where the music was created,
Right.
rather than the reflections of my own control room.
Exactly.
That's clever.
And this can have a significant impact on your mixing decisions.
You're less likely to overcompensate for the acoustics of your control room if your brain is primarily focused on the sound of the original recording space.
So how do we actually manipulate this ITD?
Yeah.
Is it all about fancy acoustic panels and complex calculations?
Well, acoustic treatment does play a role.
Okay.
The Davis paper surprisingly suggests that you can adjust the ITD by simply moving the mixing console closer to or farther from the rear wall.
Seriously.
Okay, so this does not work. Not in a home studio and not in most studios. Technically, yes, you can adjust this ITD gap by just moving your speakers further and closer, well, in relation to the front and in relation to the back wall. But what they're completely ignoring here is how that actually changes the low end response. Because obviously, as you're changing your speaker location, you're also changing your listening position. And as you change your listening position, you will change how the relation of standing waves work together, right? So your low end balance will change drastically as you move your listening position. So unless you're in a studio that has a fully damped low end, so where the standing waves do not appear anymore, then you do not have the luxury of moving your listening position at will. It's one of the reasons why I came up with the bass hunter technique, and this is again something that you can check out in that free mini course, the Phantom Speaker Test, to find your low end sweet spot in your room. Because unless you already have full control of your low end, which nobody does, you have to work with the pattern of standing waves in your room to get a balanced low end. You can't, unless you do that, you're working against your room and you won't be successful. So you do not have this liberty of just moving your listening position and speakers around in 99.99% of the rooms. Yeah, so theoretically this is possible, but it's ignoring all the other aspects that also come into play.
Something as simple as my desk placement can affect the perceived spaciousness of my mixes.
It can?
That's mind-blowing. It's a reminder that even subtle adjustments to our listening environment can make a world of difference.
Yeah, and this highlights the beauty of the LEDE concept. It's not just about expensive gear and complex formulas.
Right.
It's about understanding the fundamentals of sound behavior and applying that knowledge creatively.
This has been
It's true, but I'll show you in a second. I'll talk about a few shortcomings that I see, not just with this idea of moving your listening position and your speakers.
Incredibly enlightening deep dive so far.
Good.
We've gone from the mysteries of early sound to the strategic placement of diffusers and the surprising impact of something as simple as desk placement.
Right.
I'm feeling inspired to reevaluate my own studio setup.
That's great.
And we're not done yet.
Not yet.
In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore the evolution of LAT and its relevance in the modern world of music production.
All right.
We'll also delve into some practical tips for...
Did they just call LEDE LAT? I think it's a bit all over the place with how they call this concept.
taming those pesky low frequencies,
Okay.
which can be a real challenge in any listening environment.
It can
We'll
be.
see about that.
Listeners, stay tuned for the grand finale of our LEDE adventure,
Yeah.
where we'll uncover even more secrets for creating a truly accurate and inspiring sonic space.
Secrets.
Welcome back, listeners, to the final chapter of our deep dive into LE control rooms. We've covered a lot of ground,
Yeah.
from the sneaky problem of early sound to the strategic placement of diffusers
Right.
and the power of that initial time delay gap.
Yeah.
But before we wrap things up, I'm curious, how has the LAT concept evolved over the years?
Okay.
And where does it stand in today's world of digital music production?
That's a great question. The LEDE concept was born in the analog era,
Right.
but its principles remain incredibly relevant even in today's digital landscape.
Okay.
Think about it. While we have amazing tools for manipulating sound in the digital realm,
Yeah.
The acoustics of our physical listening spaces
Uh-huh.
still have a profound impact on what we hear.
So no matter how powerful our digital audio workstations or plugins are,
Right.
we can't escape the laws of physics.
Exactly.
Those earlier reflections still happen in the real world
Yeah.
long before the sound reaches our microphones or our computers.
Thank you, Bob and Jane, for doing my marketing for me.
That's right. And that's why LED, with its focus on creating a controlled listening environment, remains such a valuable tool.
Okay.
It helps us bridge the gap between the physical and the virtual, ensuring that what we hear in our control rooms translates accurately to other listening environments.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So what are some key takeaways for those of us who might not have the luxury of a purpose-built LED studio?
Sure.
Are there any practical tips we can apply to our own listening spaces,
Yeah.
even if they're not acoustically perfect?
Absolutely. One of the simplest yet most effective things you can do is pay attention to speaker placement.
Right.
Even small adjustments can make a big difference in minimizing those pesky early reflections.
So it's not just about fancy acoustic treatment. It's about
You can't really minimize, or you can't get rid of early reflections. They will happen no matter where you place your speakers. The question is, how are they composed? How are they spaced in relation to each other? And in practice, you can't really do that kind of optimization using measurements. I mean, you can if you're very, very good at understanding, reading, and interpreting these types of measurements and how they relate to what you're hearing. But what you can do is just use your ears, because obviously, if you experiment with different speaker locations, you will hear how that changes the sound, and then you can subjectively pick the one that sounds the best to you. Yeah, and if you go about this in a strategic way, then you can actually narrow down the best positions just by using your ears. And that's what the Phantom Speaker Test is all about. Again, you can check that out for free on my website.
understanding how sound interacts with the surfaces in my room.
Right.
And positioning my speaker strategically.
Exactly. The Davis paper offers some great guidelines for this.
Okay.
For example, they recommend placing speakers a reasonable distance from the front wall to avoid those strong early reflections.
Okay, that makes no sense whatsoever. Unfortunately, this is still one of those myths that gets spread around continuously, unfortunately. But this makes no sense, because in order to, again, avoid early reflections, right, you have to, the idea is to push them outside of this Haas time frame, right? So basically you want to delay them by more than 50 milliseconds after the direct sound, right? And so in order to do that, you'd have to increase the distance the sound has to travel enough so it is delayed by 50 milliseconds. And how long is that? Well, or how far is that rather? So sound travels roughly 1 foot every millisecond. So you'd have to actually create a reflection path that is longer than 50 feet for this particular scenario, right? So in meters, what would that be? So sound travels roughly 1 meter in 3 milliseconds. So we're looking at, what, 17 meters? It's totally ridiculous, yeah? And obviously, just by moving your speakers a meter or two away from the front wall, it won't do anything. It actually makes things worse, because you're also introducing the speaker boundary interference effect at lower frequencies the further you move your speakers from the wall. Basically, in any reasonable room, you cannot escape reflections by moving your speakers away from any surface. It does not work, period. Yeah. So we can just ignore this idea completely in the first place, instead rely on our ears to tell us where the stereo sound field works properly, because you do need that to work for mixing, otherwise you cannot work. Yeah. So that's what you're optimizing for. Then you just live with the reflection pattern that creates. Unfortunately, if you're in a better circumstance where your room is actually treated already, or your reflection pattern is more controlled, you've got reflection control, then you can actually increase the distance between your listening position and your speakers by moving the speakers up against the wall. And that will actually improve the response because you're getting rid of speaker boundary interference in the lowest frequencies. You're shifting that up into the higher frequency spectrum. Unfortunately, at the time, this was still an idea. I don't know how they got this wrong. Maybe Bob and Jane just read it wrong. I don't know.
That's a good reminder.
Oh.
What about those of us working in smaller spaces?
Yeah.
Where it's not always possible to achieve those ideal distances.
Right.
Any tips for maximizing accuracy in less than ideal rooms?
Absolutely. The Davis paper emphasizes the importance of creating what they call a reflection-free zone around the listening position.
So it's like carving out a sonic sweet spot where I can hear the direct sound from the speakers with minimal interference.
Exactly. And while dedicated acoustic treatment is ideal, you can achieve a surprising amount of improvement with strategic placement of everyday items. For example, a thick rug on the floor can help absorb reflections.
Right.
No, it won't. It's nonsense.
And even something as simple as a strategically placed bookshelf can help break up those problematic reflections.
No, it won't. Unfortunately, no. Sorry.
This is all starting to sound very practical and doable.
Yeah.
It's encouraging to know that even small adjustments can make a big difference.
It is. That's the beauty of L&E.
So
It's had nothing to do with LEDE, obviously. I'm just to kind of explain why I just responded so negatively to these two comments. It's not a question of yes or no, does it work or does it not work? It's a question of how well does it work? Yeah. And yes, a bookshelf will do better than just bare concrete, but only marginally. That's the whole point. Yes, it will improve things, but by this much. And that won't actually make your life any easier. Yeah. It might, well, unless you're really living in a concrete bunker, you're trying to work in a concrete bunker, it might make things a little bit better, but it won't improve things in any substantial way that makes your life easier in terms of mixed translation, hearing your stereo sound field, and ultimately being able to work intuitively with the sound from your speakers. Yeah. So always when these kind of questions pop up or these kind of ideas, don't think about it in terms of does it work or does it not work? Always ask how well does it work? And on the scale from not working at all to perfectly working, you're probably right there at the beginning. Yeah. So just to kind of explain that a bit better.
If we were to distill the essence of LEE down to a few key principles for our listeners,
Okay.
what would they be?
All right.
What are the core takeaways they should remember?
I'd say the most important principles are minimizing those early reflections,
Okay.
creating a diffuse sound field in the live end of the room, and controlling those powerful low frequencies with a solid asymmetrical outer shell.
Those are powerful concepts.
Where did that come from? They didn't talk about that at all. It is actually in the paper. For some reason, Bob and Jane didn't mention it here in our artificial intelligence podcast. But part of the idea of live and dead end control rooms is to actually break up the standard, let's say, standing wave pattern, a resonance pattern, low frequency resonance pattern in a room by building a asymmetrical outer shell. Or it is symmetrical in relation to the listening position, but it's not a shoebox shape. It's not a rectangle. And this used to be a good idea in the sense that, yes, you're basically reducing the effect of pure axial modes, which just happen between parallel walls, but you're not getting rid of room modes. You're just shifting them around. And in my experience, you're actually making things way more unpredictable. And it's much harder to predict where those room modes shift to. Yeah. So yes, you are getting rid of the effect of room modes in a rectangular room, but you're shifting that problem into a realm where it's much harder to predict, and it might work great and it might not work at all. And I don't like that game. So I prefer to stick to a rectangular room and know what I'm dealing with and then deal with them. Right.
And it's been fascinating exploring how they all work together to create a more accurate and enjoyable listening experience.
Yeah, and as technology continues to advance, those fundamental principles will remain crucial for anyone working with sound.
Well, listeners, we've reached the end of our LEDE journey. From
Great.
unraveling the mysteries of early reflections to discovering practical tips for optimizing our own listening spaces. This deep dive has been an incredible learning experience.
It has.
I know I'm walking away with a renewed appreciation for the importance of a well-designed listening environment.
And we hope you are too. Remember, creating a great listening experience is an ongoing journey. Don't be afraid to experiment, to listen critically,
Okay?
and to keep refining your space to achieve the best possible sound.
That's great advice, and if you want to dive deeper into the fascinating world of LEDE, be sure to check out the original Davis paper. It's a treasure trove of information,
It is.
and we highly recommend it. Until next time, happy mixing.
And happy listening.
So isn't that great? First of all, incredible what AI can do these days. And they were absolutely right. I mean, at the end here, it's very much about experimentation. I highly encourage you to not be afraid of making mistakes in treating your home studio. Yeah, I mean, acoustics is not a life or death question. The worst thing that can happen is that nothing happens, right? And so feel free to experiment. And in fact, I encourage you to experiment, learn how things change, how much you need to do in a room in order to get a certain effect. All these things are really important for you to get a grasp of how acoustics work. And I think that's super important. The worst thing you can do is not get started, because then you will never know what it is you actually need to do. Yeah. All that said, I do have kind of a few issues with the live and dead end concept, right? And I think the most important one is just how applicable it is to home studios. First of all, like we didn't really touch upon in this podcast is just the aspect of low end control. Yeah, I kind of mentioned it before. You need full, proper low end control, or as it's kind of a prerequisite for this idea to work, which we don't have in a home studio. Yeah, so already from that perspective, this doesn't really work. Yeah, the second part of this is this whole idea of this ITD gap, the initial time delay gap. First of all, how they define that you should set your ITD gap is by making it bigger than the ITD gap in your recording room. Obviously, in a home studio, we are not dealing with just recordings from a single recording room. We're dealing with recordings from all over the place. So there is no one number that we can use to set our ITD gap in our home studio. So already that makes this impossible to really do. We could obviously just say, all right, let's make our ITD gap larger than the Haas effect time period. Yeah. So again, that's kind of somewhere between 20 to 50 milliseconds. In the paper, they actually kind of set this 20 millisecond mark as the threshold. But that also isn't ideal. If you think about it, again, 20 milliseconds, so that's just under 7 meters, so about 21 feet of distance that the travel distance that this first reflection needs to travel, typically the back wall. Yeah. So if it's a return path back and returning to your listening position, already you're looking at least kind of 3.5 meters, around 10 feet. Yeah. So yes, that is possible in a lot of rooms, but it might not be and that's just kind of the very kind of edge of what you're trying to do. Yeah. If you want to make that ITD gap any larger, you need a much bigger room, right? So for example, here in my room, my back wall is about 5 meters behind my speakers, about 4 meters behind me. Yeah. So that's a 9-meter path. And so that equates to roughly 27 milliseconds of travel time. Yeah, so again, that's just at the edge. And in many smaller rooms, you won't be able to do this properly. And I have an even more fundamental problem with this, and that is that they assume that you want a gap, and a gap inherently means that there's an end to this gap. But there's nothing in psychoacoustics that says we need to end this gap. I don't know of any research that says we need to bring back a set of highly dense reflections that suddenly reappears after a certain time period. There's nothing there's no research, there's nothing in psychoacoustic that says that that's somehow beneficial to mixing. Yeah. So why not make this gap much longer, aka infinitely long, aka don't have a gap at all, just suppress the room, right? There's nothing that says that that works less well than having this ITD gap. Yeah. So that's, I think, one of the main criticisms that you could have about the live and dead end concept now, 40 years later. But all that said, live and dead end made its impression on the control room design world. They were the first, as far as I know, to introduce a holistic approach to control room designs. Before that, it was all kind of individual research, but it wasn't put together into a larger system, as far as I know. Feel free to let me know if I'm wrong about that. But so just because of that, it's worth looking at this paper. And they introduced this whole idea of the reflection-free zone. They introduced the research of reflections causing comb filters and how that affects your perception of the direct sound. All of those ideas are still true today. But again, like I also mentioned, some aspects of this, like the ITD gap, I don't think work 40 years on. It doesn't really work in smaller spaces because you need a large enough space. And there's also the whole question of whether you need a gap at all. And in my opinion, you don't. But I hope that was insightful. I hope you learned something here. If you had any questions about live and dead end and how that works, with a little luck, you'll be a little smarter now. You'll have a little better idea. And let me know if this is a format of summarizing research papers with Notebook LM. If you want me to keep doing this, I definitely want to continue looking at the other control room design approaches that have come since live and dead end in one way or the other. So make sure you keep a lookout for that. But as always, let's keep learning to trust our ears and having fun making the music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.